Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Jana Balabha Girivaridhari. Gopi Jana Balabha Girivaridhari. Yashoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana. Yashoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana. Jamuna Tira Vanachari. Jamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gopi Jana Balabha Girivaridhari. Yashoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana. Yashoda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana. Jamuna Tira Vanachari. Jamuna Tira Vanachari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Jaya Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari. Gaur Premanandi. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Everyone together, please. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devyam Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udirayat Nastatraishva Bhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Tamashloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtaki. This morning we are completing the Uddhava Gita after a long summer, and I just wanted to stay first by expressing my appreciation for everyone, especially who did Krishna lunch over this summer. I know how austere it is, how hot it is. I work out in my farm every evening for an hour and I'm drenched. So a lot of tapasya and so many people benefited. I just, again, express my appreciation for everybody who's done this yajna this summer, headed by Advaita Prabhu. So, of course, cooking is always soaking you with sweat. So let's not forget Shyam Gopal Prabhu, our illustrious chef. Let's hear it. Haribo! I hope you can hear us. All right. Right. Well, yesterday, Shyamala read some texts from this first half of this concluding chapter. And this is, again, the conversation between Krishna and Uddhava at the very end. And the Uddhava Gita is 27 chapters, so it's 50% longer than the Bhagavad Gita. But the way it ends has a lot of similarities. So before we read these last few verses, I want to just backtrack a little bit and look at some of these from yesterday. Let's see, I think verse number 26 for starters. Yeah, verse number 26. So this is Krishna. All right, now, so much of the verses we read yesterday are what's called the Pala Shruti. What is the Pala Shruti? The fruits of hearing, right. Pala is fruit and Shruti is hearing. So Krishna goes on and on. Anyone who hears this, let me just read some of them, they're so ecstatic. Let's see. Anyone who fixes his attention on these clear answers to your questions will attain the eternal confidential goal of the Vedas, the supreme absolute truth. And then this one who liberally disseminates this knowledge among my devotees is the bestower of the absolute truth, and to him I give my very own self. Does that remind anyone of a verse from the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita? Pardon? Yes, Krishna says, Nachatasmin manuseshu, the one who shares this message of Bhagavad Gita is most dear to me, and there will never be one more dear to me. Okay, so this is one of the parallels. Let's just read on these, they're so ecstatic. Let's say together, he who loudly recites the supreme knowledge, which is the most lucid and purifying, becomes purified day by day, for he reveals from each others with a lamp of transcendental knowledge. And next, anyone who regularly listens to this knowledge with faith and attention, all the while engaging in my pure devotional service, will never become bound by the reactions of the material world. Another blessing I'm hearing. And again, just as in the Gita, Krishna glorifies the person who speaks. Then he says, and even if you just hear, anyone who just hears this Bhagavad Gita will attain the planets where the pious dwell. So again, a parallel. Next verse. My dear friend Uddhava, have you now completely understood this transcendental knowledge? Are the confusion and lamentation that arose in your mind now dispelled? I believe this is the verse Shyamala drew a comparison with yesterday, right? Krishna says the same thing to Arjuna. All right, now I've told you everything. Then he says, Yate chasi tata kuru, which one devotee said, this is my very favorite verse in the Gita. What is that? Where Krishna says, now do whatever you want to do. Yeah, so he doesn't impose. And this is one of the beauties of the theology of Bhagavad Gita, Vaishnavism, is that Krishna does not insist. He explains, and then he says, so you know everything, now you decide. He could force us. He could say, you better follow this, or I'm going to really let you have it. But he's just so gracious, because that allows us to give our love to him freely, without coercion or threat. So this is another parallel. Then, text 30. You should not share this instruction with anyone who is hypocritical, atheistic, or dishonest, or with anyone who will not listen faithfully, who is not a devotee, and who is simply not humble. Does that remind you of another verse from the Gita? Yes, remember there Krishna says that one should not explain this wisdom to one who is not austere. But here it is even more elaborate, all of these disqualifications. And then the next verse, more of the same. This knowledge should be taught to one who is free from these bad qualities, who is dedicated to the welfare of the Brahmins, who is kindly disposed, saintly and pure, and if common workers and women are found to have devotion for the Supreme Lord, they are also to be accepted as qualified hearers. So here women get a bad rap again, but I do want to point out that he also says that common workers, right, this is Shudra. Shudra, is that what the word used? I'm wondering. Let's see. Yep, Shudra is the word. Yeah, so the point is that in Kali Yuga, Kalau Shudra Sambhava, everybody is born less than a Shudra. Kalau Shudra Sambhava. So it is no big qualification to be in a male body, as opposed to these fallen women, you see. And this really stings people who appreciate equity in society to read statements like this. It should sting everybody, because it is, not the verse itself, but the misinterpretation should sting. You know, why are people thinking, why would men think themselves superior just by dint of their birth? Their birth is on the same level as everyone else in Kali Yuga, Papa Yonaiha. So this is the qualification for those who are deserving to hear Gita. And we see Srila Prabhupada brought Krishna consciousness to very unqualified people with no piety and background. And it's become very popular amongst the Indian communities, in not only in India, but in other parts of the world where there are immigrants. Why? Because they have immigrants, or Indians rather, have this inborn DNA inclination, understanding of devotion. And it's just very easy. It's much easier for somebody who has that birth to take up devotional service. There's heritage, there's millennia of tradition, so it's a natural step. But what a tremendous U-turn it is for people who are brought up in completely different circumstances to take up devotion. See, but this is the vision of Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Srila Prabhupada, and what to speak of Krishna himself. He's saying now anybody is eligible to understand. Doesn't matter what their birth is. So this is one of his very important last instructions to Uddhava. Enough, Prabhu?
I have a question. Who is that? It says, who is dedicated to the welfare of the Brahmins?
Well, dedicated to the welfare of Brahmins means people in other varnas who are performing their duties. The Kshatriyas protect the Brahmins, Vaishyas support the Brahmins, Sudras serve the Brahmins. So those who respect Brahminical culture and the position of spiritual leaders. Even if they're not spiritual leaders themselves, this is the point. They just appreciate and value and support them.
I believe Srila Prabhupada said once that the Indians are standing one step away from Krishna but facing away from him, whereas like the Americans are standing 10 steps away from Krishna but facing towards him.
Yes, that's right. Srila Prabhupada said also that to preach to a Westerner is like waking up a sleeping person. To preach to an Indian is like trying to wake up someone who is pretending to be asleep. Yeah, that's virtually impossible depending on the determination. Okay. All right, so let's move on here. So we're going to read text 36 today and finish this chapter. So, did you like reading together? Was that fun? Yeah. All right, why don't we try that instead of messing with... Oh, Meet, stop everything. Meet has a comment. After that, okay. All right, so let's all read these together, these last few. Huh? Steadying in his mind, which had become overwhelmed with love, Uddhava felt extremely grateful to Lord Krishna, the greatest hero of the Yadu dynasty. My dear King Parikshit, Uddhava bowed down to touch the Lord's lotus feet with his head and then spoke with folded hands. Uddhava said, O unborn, primeval Lord, Although I had fallen into the great darkness of illusion, my ignorance has now been dispelled by your merciful association. Indeed, how can cold, darkness, and fear exert their power over one who has approached the brilliant sun? In return for my insignificant surrender, you have mercifully bestowed upon me, your servant, the torchlight of transcendental knowledge. Therefore, what devotee of yours who has any gratitude could ever give up your lotus feet and take shelter of another master? The firmly binding ropes of my affection for the families of the Dasharas, Vrishnis, Antakas, and Sattvatas, a rope you originally cast over me by your illusory energy for the purpose of developing your creation, is now cut off by the weapon of transcendental knowledge of the self. Obeisances unto you, O greatest of yogis. Please instruct me, who am surrendered unto you, how I may have undeviating attachment to your lotus feet. The personality of Godhead said, my dear Uddhava, take my order and go to my ashram called Badarika. Purify yourself both touching and also bathing in the holy waters there, which have emanated from my lotus feet. Rid yourself of all sinful reactions with the sight of the sacred Alakanandana river. Dress yourself in bark and eat whatever is naturally available in the forest. Thus you should remain content and free from desire, tolerant of all dualities, good-natured, self-controlled, peaceful, and endowed with transcendental knowledge and realization. With fixed attention, meditate constantly upon these instructions I have imparted to you and assimilate their essence. Fix your words and thoughts upon me and always endeavor to increase your realization of my transcendental qualities. In this way, you will come beyond the destinations of the three modes of material nature and finally come back to me. Shukadeva Goswami said, thus addressed by Lord Krishna, whose intelligence destroys all the suffering of material life, Sri Uddhava circumambulated the Lord and then fell down, placing his head upon the Lord's lotus. Although Uddhava was free from the influence of all material dualities, he drenched the Lord's lotus feet with his tears. Greatly fearing separation from him, for whom he felt such indestructible affection, Uddhava was distraught, and he could not give up the Lord's company. Finally, feeling great pain, he bowed down to the Lord again and again, placed the slippers of his master upon his head, and departed. Thereupon, placing the Lord deeply within his heart, the great devotee Uddhava went to Badarika Ashrama. By engaging there in austerities, he attained the Lord's personal abode, which had been described to him by the only friend of the universe, Lord Krishna himself. Spoke to his devotee with Victorian knowledge, which comprises the entire ocean of spiritual bliss. Anyone within this universe who receives this narration with great faith is assured of liberation. I offer my obeisances to that Supreme Personality of Godhead, the original and greatest of all beings, Lord Sri Krishna. He is the author of the Vedas, and just to destroy his devotee's fear of material existence, like a bee, he has collected this nectarian essence of all knowledge and self-realization. Thus he has awarded to his many devotees this nectar from the ocean of bliss, and by his mercy have drunk it. Right. And thus in the translations. So there's so many differences here in the conclusion of the Uddhava Gita and Bhagavad Gita. We talked about some similarities, but let's look at these differences. First of all, when Krishna asks this question in the Gita, as he asks here, have you now understood everything I've explained to you? What does Arjuna say? He just says very briefly, yes, I understand, and I'm ready to fight and act according to your instructions. But here Uddhava goes on for several verses, and then he asks him again another question. Now, how can I remember these instructions? One of my God brothers used to interrupt. Whenever there was a question that began, how can I, he would just say, by chanting Hare Krishna. Kind of a cynical approach. I don't believe in that personally, but anyway. The point is that Uddhava is taking time to ask this further question, to really cement the instructions in his mind. And so then Krishna again elaborates. Now, okay, I want you to go to Badarika ashram, live like an ascetic, and constantly meditate upon me. And in this way, when you leave this body, you'll attain to me. So there's this last exchange. And this constitutes what is called the denouement. Anyone know this word, the denouement? Yes?
The denouement is, it's either the climax or like what comes right after the climax.
It's what comes after the climax.
After the climax of the story.
Right, like you've ever seen in movies, and the plot is finished up, and then it said, and this person went here, and this person went there, and that's called the denouement. What happens to everybody after it's over. So now Uddhava is getting his instructions, go and meditate in this austere place, Badarika ashram. That's way up in the mountains, it's cold, and it's where yogis go to separate from the world and from their cell phones. Yeah. So the contrast for Uddhava is very interesting because he was a palace dweller. He was one of the royalty, he was among the royalty in Krishna's family. You remember when Krishna left Vrindavan and he went to Mathura, killed Kamsa, and then assumed the throne. He did not assume the throne, rather, but his relative Ugrasen became the king. So resumed his rule. So Uddhava, a cousin of Krishna, was the person that Krishna sent back to the residents of Vrindavan with a message about his plans. All the residents of Vrindavan were wondering, when is Krishna going to come back? Is Krishna going to come back? So Krishna had obligations to stay in Mathura because he'd been gone for so long, and his mother and father were there. All of his relatives wanted to see him, and yet everyone in Vrindavan was very anxious. So he went to Uddhava, who looked very much like Krishna, practically an exact replica. He said, you go please give this confidential instruction to their message to the residents of Vrindavan. So then he told them the message, and Uddhava went. So when he got to Vrindavan, all of the residents were very happy to see him. He came to the house of Nanda Maharaj, and they worshipped him, and they welcomed him. Everyone was happy except the gopis. And the gopis saw this chariot pull up, this fancy chariot in front of Nanda Maharaj's house. And they began talking, oh, who is this visiting Nanda Maharaj? Perhaps it's Akrura. It's not enough for him to have taken Krishna away from us. Now he must want us to burn ourselves in a funeral pyre. That's probably why he's come back to finish the job. This is their discussion they're having when they see Uddhava. But then when Uddhava came out and looked so much like Krishna, they were just stunned. And as the simple village girls they were, they just kind of walked up to him and stared at him. Any of you who are in Western bodies, if you've been to Mayapur, have you had this experience? They want to take pictures.
I started charging after a
while. It's interesting. That's the advantage of Westerners in India. And the advantages of Indians in the West is they look like they're authentic. Indians to the Westerners, oh, they must know their stuff. So this is the way, in the same innocent way, the gopis came up to Uddhava and just stared at him. And of course, Uddhava felt rather uncomfortable, like, what's going on here? But then they began asking about Krishna, and he began telling them about Krishna. And they were very interested to hear, and going through all the emotional machinations. Is he coming back? And Uddhava said, look, he sent me here with a message for you. And that message is that you know that I am everywhere. So how could I be possibly separated from you at any time? And you know how some of the gopis who could not come and join us in those moonlit nights when we were performing the rasa dance, they stayed home because they couldn't sneak out, but they meditated upon me in their hearts so deeply that they were connected with me. And so you can also do that because I'm present here. So this was the message that Krishna delivered. And the gopis, being a little gullible, accepted it. They said, oh, okay, at least Krishna was thinking of us. So yes, so we'll meditate on Krishna being everywhere and present with us. Well, this is very instructive for us, this understanding of Krishna, because Krishna is always present before us. He's present right now, like in full majesty, right before us, but we don't see him, we don't think about him, or we're dealing with things in the immediate surroundings and reacting. But Krishna is present always. He's always right in front of us. And that's such a heavy, powerful thought, isn't it? Just how many times during the day do we realize that? Whatever I'm doing, Krishna's right here. I don't know about you, but me, I am like regularly in touch with my cell phone during the day. But that's not Krishna. You know? But just as we're so drawn to our cell phones or to our friends, how amazing it would be to be that drawn to Krishna. That was what Srila Prabhupada was like. He was in constant communion with Krishna, and you could just feel it when you saw him. That gave him this utter sense of detachment from everything else because he was so connected with Krishna. Once in New York, a reporter asked him, "Do you see God?" And one of his assistants, Rameshwar Swami, Prabhupada indicated he could answer. So he began speaking. Well, the pure devotee understands that God is everywhere, and he began giving this philosophical answer. And then Prabhupada cut him off. He said, "No, face to face, face to face." He's seeing Krishna all the time, face to face. So in that respect, what Uddhava was giving the gopis was very pertinent and valuable information. And they accepted it at that point. But then later, many years later, in Kurukshetra, again the gopis were with Krishna. And this time they were seeing Krishna in person. And they kind of expressed to him, "Well, you never came back." And he again began the same philosophical reply. "Well, how could we ever be separated? You know, I'm in everything and I'm everywhere, so how could we?" But this time they weren't having it. They weren't buying. And they said, "No, we took it last time from Uddhava, but not this time. This time we want you back in Vrindavan." Lord Chaitanya spoke a beautiful verse that was composed, I believe, by Rupa Goswami, saying that these are the same moonlit nights of Chaitra, and you're the same Krishna, and I'm the same Radha, but it is not, I need to see you in Vrindavan. It's not the same. So the gopis had this mood, and therefore what did they do? They began pulling Krishna and Balaram and Subhadra back to Vrindavan. That's the Rath Yatra festival, pulling Krishna into your heart. So the gopis, seeing Uddhava, were reminded of Krishna and somewhat eased, and this was Krishna's purpose. So Uddhava met the gopis, and he saw Nanda Maharaj, and Nanda Maharaj was this village squire who was totally convinced that like Krishna is his son. And Uddhava saw that they were so absorbed in Krishna. The gopis, Nanda Maharaj, Yashoda Mataji, all of them, he saw this level of bhakti that he had never experienced in Mathura. It said that Krishna's pastimes in Mathura are perfect, in Dwarka more perfect, and in Vrindavan most perfect. So they're perfect everywhere, but there are degrees. And so when Uddhava saw this devotion of the Vrajabasis in Vrindavan, he was so impressed that he went running back to Dwarka, dashed into the palace, and said right in front of Krishna and the whole entourage assembled there, the residents of Vrindavan are just overwhelmed with ecstatic love for you. He hadn't seen that before. So this is the person who's getting these instructions from Krishna. Now, having heard, having experienced the residents of Vrindavan, he's seeing how his dynasty, his whole family has been wiped out, and Krishna alone is left. And so now he's just saying, please give me the essence of your instructions. So this is the Uddhava Gita. And the last instruction now, go off and live this austere life. You've been a member of the royal family, now go off and dress in tree bark, eat whatever comes your way, and minimize your external necessities so that you can internally meditate on me. This is very much in the same mood that Uddhava was explaining to the gopis. Now, Uddhava, you go and become absorbed in me in this environment. So as we discussed last week, the processes for self-realization differ from age to age. And the kind of austerities that Uddhava is being asked to do are austerities that we could never do. I mean, can you imagine wearing tree bark and eating whatever comes your way? I mean, we can't even go to bed at 9 o'clock, most of the time. That one little austerity, oh, that's way too difficult. So, in this very last verse, I'd like to read, because it's such a very beautiful analogy and comment. The Sanskrit is rather tough. Let me just have to figure out what is this. Bhava bhayam apahanti jnana vijnana saram. Is that right? Vigamakrit upachara brahmavlade. No, it's one syllable short. Bhava bhayam apahantum jnana vijnana. No, it's Bhava bhayam apahantum jnana vijnana saram. It doesn't, you can cram it in. This is Nigama Krid Uparate Pragna Vadveda Saram. The first one? It didn't quite fit. Amritam udahitas chapayayad pritya bhargam bam bam. I don't know what that one is. It's a very unusual meter. Sometimes there are meters like this that just appear in unique places in the Bhagavatam. So this last speech of Krishna may be like that. I mean, of Shukadeva, excuse me. Anyway, so all glories to the Sanskrit. Let's read the synonyms. Let's read these aloud, please. Bhava, a material life. Bhayam, the fear. Bhavantum, in order to take away. Jnana, vijnana, of knowledge and self-realization. Saram, the essence. Nigama, of the Vedas. Krit, the author. Upajahare, delivered. Bringavat, like a bee. Veda Saram, the essential meaning of the Vedas. Amritam, the nectar. Udahita, from the ocean. Cha, and Apayayat, made to drink. Britya Vargam, his many devotees. Purusham, to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Rishabham, the greatest. Adyam, the first of all beings. Krishna Samyam, named Lord Krishna. Mataha, bow down. Asmi, I am. I offer my obeisances to that Supreme Personality of Godhead, the original and greatest of all beings, Lord Sri Krishna. He is the author of the Vedas, and just to destroy his devotees' fear of material existence, like a bee, he has collected this nectarian essence of all knowledge and self-realization. Thus he has awarded to his many devotees this nectar from the ocean of bliss, and by his mercy they have drunk it. Report. Just as a bee extracts nectar from a flower without harming the flower, Lord Sri Krishna extracts the essence of all Vedic knowledge without disturbing the elaborate system of Vedic advancement. In other words, Lord Sri Krishna establishes himself as the goal of Vedic knowledge without destroying preliminary, inferior processes that may be applicable to grossly materialistic men. Sri Shukadev Goswami thus concludes by offering his obeisances to the spiritual master of the entire universe, Lord Sri Krishna. And thus end the purports of the humble servants of his divine grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, to the 11th canto, 29th chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam, entitled Bhakti Yoga, and the entire Uddhava Gita. Very, very auspicious. We would get to read the Uddhava Gita spoken by the Purushottama, Supreme Personality of Godhead, in the month of Purushottama. This is the these are exceptional places in the Bhagavatam where Krishna is speaking directly. Whereas throughout the Gita he does, in the Bhagavatam it's only incrementally. Often we're hearing from his devotees, which is just as good, but still very special. So when Uddhava saw the gopis in Vrindavan, one of the things he noticed was this one particular gopi was sort of over by herself in a field. And she was having a conversation with a bee, just as we're reading here. He was watching as she said to this bee, "Oh, I know who you are. You're a messenger from Krishna. You've come from the big city just to give me some kind of baloney from Krishna. I know, and you're touching my feet in such a humble way. And, you can just go back and tell Krishna that I don't buy his messengers." So she's speaking very harshly like this to the bee. And then the bee went away. And then all of a sudden she said, "Oh, my dear little bumblebee, I didn't mean to offend you. Please come back. How is Krishna?" So this is this kind of binary stage of perception that Uddhava was witnessing in Radharani. Radharani is not mentioned by name in this conversation because there are several reasons given. Radharani is not mentioned in the Bhagavatam because one thing is Shukadev may have become too ecstatic talking about Radharani and he could not finish giving the narration to Maharaj Parikshit. And other reasons are given, but she's only mentioned in this way, like indirectly. So I wanted to talk about bees, and just this morning I was out at the electric panel at my house, and all of a sudden I thought I got zapped by electricity, but I actually got stung by a bee. And so I thought, okay, Krishna must want me to talk about bees. And this analogy is so beautiful because the bee can take nectar from a flower without disturbing the flower. It doesn't come in and just demolish it, just very delicately. And this process is called madhukari, and it's recommended for saintly persons to go to one flower and take a little, next flower, take a little, next flower, take a little. Saintly persons are never supposed to have one patron who just gives them money, because then they become obliged to that person. So take a little bit here, a little bit there for one's sustenance. In this way, one lives without security and depending upon many, many people. But that's good for the sadhu, the saintly person, and it's also good for the people who have multiple opportunities to engage and to serve. So the bee is like that, taking a little bit here, a little bit here, a little bit there. But the flower is not disturbed. So what is the analogy in the purport of what is the flower being compared to? All of the Vedas. So this is yet another interesting contrast. Forgive me, I always bring this up in my Judeo-Christian background, but the Bible was such a sacred book to me growing up, and yet I didn't understand it at all. But it was always like the authority of spiritual life. So in the Bible there are supposedly like every word is supposed to be true, and yet there's many contradictory instructions. Some years ago, for example, there was a lady who gave classes, who gave psychological advice. She was a psychologist, Dr. Laura. Anyone remember Dr. Laura? She was a big radio personality maybe 20, 30 years ago. People would call her up and ask advice, and she would give advice. So anyway, she was very anti-gay. and she cited this reference in the Old Testament that homosexuality is an abomination. So then this very clever person wrote her a letter and said, "Thank you very much for clarifying this. I'm very clear on this now." And I have a few other questions from this section of the Old Testament. It says in the Old Testament that one should, it says in the same chapter, Leviticus, that one should enslave one's neighbors. So which do you think would be easier, the Canadians or the Mexicans? Anyway, it's a hilarious letter if you want to see, but it goes on about 10 or 15 similar references from this same place that are like, it says here that one should, if one's daughter is unchaste, one should sell her to a brothel. What do you think would be a fair price? Do you remember any of this, Rasika?
I remember Dr. Laura, but I don't remember you.
Okay, I'll see if I can find the letter. I'm just bringing it up because there are many passages in the Vedas that are not appropriate for each and every circumstance. Only one is appropriate. Only one message from the Vedas is appropriate for every circumstance, and that is bhakti. That is surrender to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Vedaischa sarvair aham eva vedyo. Krishna says in the 15th chapter that by all the Vedas I am to be known. Vedanta krit veda vedeva chaham. Because I wrote them, I compiled them. So in his magnanimity, Krishna makes himself accessible to everybody, regardless of their motivations. Even if one is not purely coming to God for serving and for loving, even if one is coming to God for some material benefit, please God, let me win the lottery. It's $1.5 billion, please. Even if one is, that's better than to neglect God altogether. Akama sarvakama va moksha kama udaradi. In the second canto, Shukadev says that whether one is freed of desires or has all kinds of desires, still one should approach the Supreme Personality of Godhead in Bhakti Yoga. That message transcends all the other instructions of the Vedas, which relate to warfare and social life and cooking and health and architecture and everything. All varieties of human knowledge are contained therein, but all of them are just meant to bring us to the point of bhakti. So here Krishna is being compared to a bee who just takes out the essence without disturbing the other elements of the Vedas. He doesn't have to reject them. He just tacitly explains that they are preliminary steps. Remember in chapter 2 of Bhagavad Gita, he makes some very strong statements about the Vedas. Remember, Krishna is saying to Arjuna, when your mind is no longer disturbed by the flowery words of the Vedas, then you will see what is actually what is what. And men of small knowledge study the Vedas, right? Veda Vidavata Rajan. They study the Vedas for the purpose of elevation to more material enjoyment. And they are always forced to come back to this planet, this plane. So the point is that many diversions, we're being given the essence here by Srila Prabhupada, by the Acharyas, by the Srimad Bhagavatam, just being given the sara, the essential part. To the Acharyas, that is the whole purpose, no matter what our background is. To the people who are very infatuated with the Vedas, they look at us and they say, oh, you're not qualified to understand. This is the unfortunate condition of people who are very enamored by the subordinate or ancillary parts of the Vedas. They say people who are not Brahmins can never understand the Vedas. And Prabhupada said, there's a Brahman on every street corner, go out and find them. All right, so this is conclusion of the Gita. I believe tomorrow, Rasika Prabhu, you are going to give a review of the entire Gita. Summary. Could you, would you mind preparing a few questions to quiz these innocent bystanders? Okay. All right. So if anyone is so inclined, you might do a little review. Good. It's a lot of information. So much of it is in the Gita, and yet as we read here, it also elaborates on the Gita. It's not quite as intense a situation. Krishna, Uddhava, it's relaxed. Krishna, Arjuna, it's right before the battle. People are checking their watches. Any questions, reflections? Govinda Prabhu. Oh, and then me.
You were speaking about how Prabhupada, he said that he was seeing Krishna face to face, and I was thinking how, for us, it's a goal. I mean, that's the Abhideya Prayojana, right?
Right.
And so I was just thinking, I wanted to know how do we get there? Is that like something realistic?
Chant Hare Krishna. No, this is a very important question. In the Brahma Samhita, we read that one can see Krishna if the eyes are tinged with the salve of love. Love means that we've come to trust this person. Love means that we think about this person, we want to please this person, we're aware of the desires of this person, and we want to fill them. We anticipate them even before they are expressed. The Shastra gives the analogy of the two birds. Right? So the two birds are sitting in the tree. One of them is eating the fruits of the tree, and sometimes they're sweet and sometimes they're bitter. That's the nature of material enjoyment, that it looks like it's going to be so good, and then you suffer like a dog. Right? Yeah. That's what's going on. That's what the dumb bird is absorbed in. And the other bird, big bird, is just very compassionately watching as we suffer and enjoy and suffer and enjoy. So that's taking our attention away from the fruits of the tree and turning it to our beloved, dear, friendly bird who is so compassionately waiting. That's how we begin to revive our relationship with Krishna. We don't do it just by giving up the fruits or the material pursuits. That's a byproduct. What really happens is we come to appreciate the gifts that Krishna has given us, his kindness. Everyone has a notion of God as omnipotent, but only through understanding Krishna can we see how kind he is, how personable he is, how tolerant he is, how patient he is. So like parents, for example, we grow up and then when we're 3 years old, our parents, I got the best mama and daddy in the whole wide world. And then fast forward about 10 years, and said, Mom, Dad, excuse me, could you please go live in another state? So then, maybe down the road, when we get a little older, we come to appreciate my parents have sacrificed so much for me. Often that happens when we have our own children, which is why becoming a guru is so important in Krishna consciousness. But what our parents sacrificed for us makes us appreciate them when we are mature. In the same way, what Krishna is giving us makes us appreciate him as our devotion matures. It's just this, what is it called? The salve of time can't force the issue. But if we understand intellectually, then gradually we begin making that U-turn from the fruits to our friendly bird. Okay, other sections of Dvaita Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Thank you so much, Prabhu. Something on the line what Govinda Prabhu was asking and what you was answering. The whole chapter is entitled Bhakti Yoga, and I heard somewhere, might have been in Science of Self-Realization or one of those introductory books, in regards to seeing Krishna face to face, how Prabhupada says that to be engaged in devotional service is as good as seeing Krishna face to face.
Yes.
And sometimes we have to be careful in order to get Krishna, not to get distracted by Krishna. In a sense that, the seva, the principle of service, devotional service, is a higher principle than darshan. And as Prabhupada said also, even mosquito is in the presence of a king, but is simply a disturbance. So being always service-oriented is as good, actually sometimes even better.
Yes, to be service-oriented or to connect with Krishna through service. It's certainly more accessible to us. Then the simple evidence of that is that in traditional ashrams, people would renounce the world and they would chant 64, 96 rounds, or chant all day, and that was acceptable. If you can do it, just sit and chant all day, that's the perfection. Once a devotee said to Srila Prabhupada, excuse me, when we are old and retire, can we move to Mayapur and just chant? Srila Prabhupada said, you may do that, but I'm not advanced enough. So when we are in the mode of passion, service is a great asset because we can engage. We can be connected with Krishna even if we're not thinking of Krishna. And Prabhupada said you can't serve somebody without thinking of them. So indirectly we are thinking about Krishna when we're doing devotional service. It's so hard, especially for students though, excuse me, students and employees, to connect my service or my study to service, my work or my study to, is this my service for Krishna? Doing this mundane job or studying this mundane subject? People often have that challenge. And so we have to see how the connections to Krishna are there, even if we're in school or in college or in the workforce, generally because we're grihastas and our service is providing an environment for a family to grow up in Krishna consciousness, to prosper and to execute devotional service. Therefore, by providing all facilities, we are accommodating, we are serving. So, thank you. All right, anything else? Meat left in disappointment. No, I asked him. He said no. He was fine. Okay. I thought you said, how about me? Sorry. How are we doing for breakfast, Gopal? Do you know if we got? None is ready. Okay, we have a message. Okay, so one very brief comment from John, and then we will wrap it up. Okay.
Regarding Krishna not being on the cell phone, I'm pretty renounced, disconnected from my cell phone. But sometimes I'll get a call from a devotee, either here or in Tallahassee, and every time I've said out loud, Krishna's calling, and I pick up the phone, like they have some service for me to do. I haven't been wrong yet. I've known every time when they're calling, they've got something for me to do. So it does have its purpose.
Please accept my humble obeisance. Yeah, for me it's usually timeshare inquiries, but all right. Shri Prabhupada ki jai, Mahaprasadam ki jai. Yagya Shishtasina Santo, Jate Sarva Kildishai.